A couple years back in my social work training, I had a client, I'll call him Henry. I'm going to alter some details of his story as well, of course, to maintain confidentiality. Anyway, Henry initially came to me because he was concerned about the behavior of one of his kids. But as we explored things, he began to open up about some of the struggles in his own life, which were considerable. He was addicted to the internet like no adult I've met, certainly no one his age, spending hours late into the night on Reddit and in chat rooms, unable to make himself sign off. He had hypertension and heart trouble, ate a lot of fats and sweets, and definitely suffered from social anxiety and I would say a sort of a chronic low-grade depression. I noticed something else too. He was a loving father to his children, but often he spoke disparagingly about himself, blamed himself for just all kinds of stuff, especially when he was telling stories about his childhood. At the time, I was just beginning to learn about a therapy model I really like that sort of invites us to look at parts of ourselves almost as if they were little personalities within us. Maybe there's a fierce part that attacks others when being criticized. Maybe there's a sad part that sort of absorbs rejection. Maybe there's an angry part that bullies the sad part to shut up so that the self can keep on functioning, that kind of thing. You know, these parts are often very adaptive for us or have been at some point. And they typically take on their roles in us as a response to some event in the past or some dynamic in the past. And they're often at war with each other. The job of therapy then is to explore each part with curiosity and compassion and acceptance so as to integrate those parts into a more healthy whole and sort of prevent them from being able to take you over in inopportune moments. So anyway, at one point, I observed to Henry that it seemed like he really liked to trash himself a lot, especially when talking about his growing up years. He sat for a moment, drumming his fingers on the office table. And then he told me this story about himself. When he was 6, just 6, the state judged both of Henry's parents, who were divorced already, unfit to care for him. And he was forced to choose between living with his paternal aunt or his maternal grandparents. 6 years old. He didn't know what to do. He chose his grandparents. His dad then stopped speaking to him. And a number of other really terrible things happened to him in his growing up years, including, experiencing some abuse, having to spend some time in a foster home at one point. He just really had a rough time. And I started to understand that really from Henry's point of view, all of that bad stuff that had happened was a result of this decision he'd made at the age of 6. It was like it all flowed out of that. And therefore, the things he'd experienced in his life were really his fault because he had made the wrong choice. His words, the wrong choice. Well, I knew, of course, that Henry was a committed father to his own kids. So I asked him to think about his 6-year-old daughter. How would he feel toward her if she were put in a position of having to make such a choice? Did it strike him as fair to ask that of a 6-year-old child? Would he ever, no matter what she chose, even if she'd chosen to go with the mom's side of the family, would he ever punish her by cutting her off? He was silent for a moment. And then he said, of course not. I would love her no matter what. Maybe, I said, the part of you that is still that scared, out of his depth, 6-year-old child needs that kind of love from you as well. And Henry's eyes seemed to sort of retract as if he were literally pulling into himself, taking this in. His drumming fingers went still, and then he nodded. The following week, Henry came back and he said he'd been thinking about our conversation, and I was right. Making him choose that had been really unfair to him. And he would never do that to his child or judge his child in the ways that he had been habitually judging himself for the decision that he'd made. It was incredible, and it turned out to be this major turning point in my work with him. He began to offer compassion and tenderness to this hurt part of himself that was still that 6-year-old. And as he did that, he began to make other kinds of changes around some of the other issues in his life. He strategized ways not to find himself in the sweets aisle at the grocery store. He actually started going to bed at a more decent hour. And most of all, his wife reported that he just seemed like a different person. He had more energy for her and the children. He didn't seem to be withdrawing into his bedroom as much as he once had. So I don't want to, try and tell you that everything was like roses and lollipops for Henry after that. But, I could see it too. Just in the way he carried himself, something had shifted. And it was just an incredible privilege to watch him find new healing and find the courage and the energy to make some changes in his life. I mention all of this today because, in the gospel, we have this famous moment when Jesus is asked which commandment is greatest. And he says essentially, there are two: love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is like the first, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm struck this time around in reading this passage by that second commandment. It's not love your neighbor more than yourself. It's love your neighbor as yourself. For that commandment to be effective, for it to be like the commandment to love God with heart, soul, and mind, you have to love yourself. We have to love ourselves. Or maybe to put it a bit more theologically, we have to embrace the incredible love that God has for us. If love of self must match love of neighbor, and if love of neighbor is like the love of God, then the implication is that these three kinds of love are really all tied together in one package. You can't practice them a la carte. In some sense, loving yourself is a way of loving God and neighbor. So, if you are anything like Henry, as I certainly am, then the focus for us in applying Jesus's commands might be to really draw in those parts of ourselves that can be so hard to accept. Give ourselves a break. Cultivate compassion for the difficult choices that we've had to make and the ways that we have chosen to protect ourselves when we felt we needed to. For truly, the lost or sad or abandoned children within us are God's children too. Amen.